Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, some people spoke, some people didn't. So good afternoon, everyone. Okay, a few more joined in, thank you. So I'm Dr. Marilyn Mobley, Vice President for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, and it's our pleasure to welcome you to our Power of Diversity series. For those who may not know, the Power of Diversity series began as a way to feature our own faculty whose work was related to diversity and inclusion, and then we began expanding it to include staff. Last year or the year before, we began including staff, and so today we get a twofer. A person who, like me, is a member of our staff. I'm a member of the leadership team, but I also have a faculty appointment in that yellow building in the English department. And so we're so pleased to have Professor Shannon with us today. And as you may know, we expanded it from our faculty to include staff and also to include national thought leaders. We're fortunate to have thought leaders on our own campus. I'm always clear to make that distinction. We have thought leaders on our own campus who get to speak all around the country, and in Dr. French's case, all over the world. And we bring thought leaders to campus who do not work here. So I wanted you to be sure to know about our Power of Diversity series, which will continue next month with Dr. Damon Williams, who has been speaking around the country since he left his position. He had been the Chief Diversity Officer at University of Wisconsin at Madison, and he then went to the Boys and Girls Club and has since been a consultant that many of us in higher ed have respected and trusted for his perspectives on diversity work in higher ed. He's the author of 2 books, and we've asked our senior leadership team to read one of them, Diversity Strategic Leadership. So our office purchased that book, and Janetta Hammock, who is our diversity program manager, who's sitting in the back, who is, as far as I'm concerned, Wonder Woman. She made sure that we had copies of the book. So if you'd like a copy, we'll share them. I think we have a few extras that we can share. But the diversity leadership team has them, and the senior leadership team has them. And then other speakers this month, Professor Cynthia Bell, who is our current Faculty Senate Chair, and Professor Jonathan Sadowski. And what I'd like to say about Professor Sadowski is he's one of the professors who explains why our new minor is called a new minor in African and African American Studies. It's a new minor in African and African American Studies, and Professor Sadowski is one of the people who is an Africanist who was very excited about the new minor. So I hope you can come hear our speakers. Our office partners with the Office for Multicultural Affairs in doing Diversity 360, and we have a lunch series that we hope, if your schedule permits, you'll be part of that. We discovered with Diversity 360, number one, people thought it was going to fix everything related to diversity. It cannot do that. But we also wanted people to have other opportunities who had been through the program and wanted to talk more about issues that have come up in their session. So that's what happens in Diversity 360. They're facilitated by people who have done sustained dialogue. And the topic is, what is global citizenship? A forward-thinking discussion. So it's perfect for our speaker today. So we hope that you'll do that and go to our website to learn about other programs that we're doing. The programs that we're doing them with you in mind. We don't just sit up and think up stuff. We try to do things that we think are relevant to our faculty, students, and staff. So we thank you for your support. So today, I want to introduce my friend, a wonderful faculty colleague, and just a good soul. You want good souls in the universe when you're doing hard work. You want to have good souls to do it with. So I'd like to read her formal bio, and I'll embellish a couple places. Dr. Shannon E. French is the Inamori Professor in Ethics and the Director of the Inamori International for Ethics and Excellence Prize Center at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. French is also a tenured professor in the university's philosophy department with a secondary appointment as a professor in the Case Western University School of Law. She also teaches in the university's Master of Arts in Military Ethics, program, which was launched last year and is the first graduate program of its kind in the country. I was at the Faculty Senate meeting when it was approved, and I said yes. Dr. French is the General Hugh Shelton Distinguished Visiting Chair in Ethics for the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College Foundation. Previously, she served as a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Before coming to Case Western Reserve University in July of 2008, Dr. French was an associate professor of philosophy at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where she taught for 11 years. She also served as associate chair of the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law at the Naval Academy. Dr. French's main area of research is military ethics, with emphasis on conduct of war issues, ethical leadership, command climate, sacrifice and responsibility, war transitions, ethical responses to terrorism, and the future of warfare. All things related to this topic she seems to be an expert on. So we are fortunate because we need to hear from you today. She is the author of many scholarly articles, book chapters, and the book, The Code of the Warrior, Exploring Warrior Values, Past and Present. Her book was released in 2003 and re-released in 2017 as an updated and expanded second edition. Dr. French also serves as the editor for the International Journal of Ethical Leadership and an associate editor for the Journal of Military Ethics. She frequently presents her research at international conferences and participates in public debates on ethical issues. Dr. French received her BA in Philosophy, Classical Studies, and History from Trinity University in Texas, and her PhD in Philosophy from Brown University in Rhode Island. We are pleased to have Dr. French as our first fall 2008 Power of Diversity speaker. We look forward to her lecture, so please join me in welcoming the person that brings us the annual buzz on campus with the Inamori Prize. Please help us welcome Dr. French.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I have many microphones here, so hopefully you can all hear me. First of all, thank you so much, Meryl, and thank you, Jeanette, for arranging this opportunity for me. I appreciate this chance to speak with you all about ethics and the power of diversity. Before I begin, though, on that, I did just want to briefly acknowledge the moment that we are in this country right now. It's been quite a day with the hearings and Dr. Ford testifying against Judge Kavanaugh today. It's not an easy day for a lot of people. It's certainly not an easy day for sexual assault survivors, and so I want to acknowledge that and just express empathy with anyone in the room who is feeling the weight of that, as indeed I am myself. But we are here to talk about topics that do relate to these kinds of moments, topics that connect to what we have in common and the causes that we can all fight together. Ethics, which is my field, is, in its broadest sense, the pursuit of the good life. To flourish and to live a life that feels meaningful. I sometimes joke with my students that basically what we're going for here is that if you get lucky enough to actually know at the end of a long life that this is the end, and you get to look back and think about what you did, you'd like to be able to say, yeah, I did okay. That was a life that had something to it. That was a life with some meaning and purpose. And what you don't want in that moment is to look back and think, oops, or, can I please have a do-over? So ethics is about that. It's about trying to make the right decisions along the way when you can in order to find that sense of meaning, that sense of flourishing. So in this, we call on many different philosophers from many different traditions. I'll even cite the obvious one for Western philosophy, the ancient philosopher Aristotle. He argued that actually everything we do, even the little things that we do, even when you get up in the morning and decide what you're going to have for breakfast, everything you do is in one way or another aimed towards this goal, this idea of flourishing. And in fact, the Greeks had a word, I still think it's a very beautiful word for it, eudaimonia. It sounds beautiful. Like if we could just achieve that, eudaimonia. And the goal there is, again, a life that really expresses and releases everything that a human life could, that allows us to be fully human and experience life that we have. The ethical rules, then, that society sets, theoretically ought to be lined up with this idea. They ought to be about promoting flourishing and preventing the opposite. And we can see the attempt at that. We can argue where it doesn't work and where it has failed, but we can see that, generally speaking, the rules that societies create tend to fall into two broad categories. Now, the minute I say that, I do so with apologies, because when you create two categories of anything, you're setting yourself up for people noticing that some things will not fit perfectly into those two categories, especially if you're in philosophy like me. But with apologies, just to move us a little forward, I'm going to set out something like two categories. And in one category, I'm going to put the kinds of ethical rules that attempt to control our less noble impulses. So in other words, the rules around ethics that have to do with what you shouldn't do, that have to do with controlling or restraining and saying that if we're going to get along, if we're going to live in a world together, if we're going to cooperate and get things done, we're going to have to limit some of the things that we do. So again, the humorous way to put this is, my freedom to swing my fist ends at your face. I cannot connect, because if I do, then I have violated your autonomy. My autonomy has limits, everyone does, if we're going to live together. So that is one way to look at ethical rules or principles, as limiting the side of us that maybe isn't the side we're the most proud of, the side that we associate with the kind of literature that we may have all encountered that looks at human nature as a barely repressed evil. We may think of something like Lord of the Flies or many other examples, but the idea that if left without these controls, we would harm one another. But the other basket that I mentioned is also important, and some of the rules of society do express more towards this side as well. And that side is where ethics encourages positive behavior. So not just about what you shouldn't do, but about what you should do. It encourages virtues like compassion, integrity, moral courage, the things that actually, if expressed, if embodied, can make human flourishing more likely, both for individuals and for society in general. So that is the other bucket, the kind of rules that we create where we say, hey, if we agree on this, maybe we'll all be better off. Maybe we can all be lifted up by this. So one side saying, control what will harm us, and another side saying, express that which will lift us all up. And that is broadly what ethics is about, to put it very simply, reducing the opportunities for us to harm one another or ourselves, while increasing the odds that we can become our best selves. And importantly, and the theme of this talk in many ways, this is true across cultures. These ideas are found in many philosophies and religions around the world, that ethics must do these two things, that it must control certain negative impulses or bad parts of human nature and help express what is best. Let me give a few examples. Buddhism, for example, sees suffering due to the attachment of humans to, let's say, fragile, finite things, things that are of this world, as a barrier to human suffering. So they offer the eightfold path to enlightenment that is intended to free people from an endless cycle of suffering, an endless cycle of pain. So you see the language there too, figuring out how you should behave to unleash potential. Islam teaches about the greater jihad, the internal struggle to conquer one's own weaknesses and vices and commit fully to a virtuous life in line with God's will. Christianity also champions strengthening the better angels of our nature to try to become closer to God, while at the same time avoiding temptations that can lead us down roads to ruin. Hinduism teaches how to follow specific paths of duty, knowledge, and devotion in order to understand one's place in the universe and fully embrace its natural order and harmony. Now, I use those examples because those are the 4 most practiced religions in the world by numbers of adherents. But obviously, I could go on and on. I could make similar points about many other traditions, from Judaism to Shinto, to Taoism, to Wicca, to the spiritual beliefs of different Native American, South American, or African tribes, and so on and on. My point, and I want to emphasize this, is not at all that these beliefs are identical. That is not what I'm saying. They obviously are not. But they have something very important in common. They are trying to provide guidance to us on how to be good people and to avoid the most common pitfalls of human existence. And I will note that the same can be said for secular ethical theories, from deontological approaches like that of Kant's categorical imperative, to consequentialist takes like Bentham's utilitarianism or Mill's harm principle. They're all part of humanity's quest to understand, well, here I'm going to quote the immortal words of Prince, how to get through this crazy thing called life. Child of the 80s here, what can I say? So because we're all human, and we're all trying to figure out how to be the best humans we can be, we have more in common than anything that divides us. We are all essentially trying to answer this same question: what is the best way for me to live my life? So it isn't a crazy idea for us to try to compare notes from time to time to see what we can learn from one another. But I want to immediately stop a possible sidetrack that this might take. What I am arguing for is not moral relativism. There are people in the room who just smiled because they're like, oh, good. I'm talking about pluralism, and let me clarify the difference. Moral relativism, which in my humble opinion is frankly a scourge, tries to insist that no views or opinions on how we should live or act have any more or less merit than any others. That there are not and cannot be universal truths on which humans might be able to agree. So if you're a moral relativist, and forgive me for this example, but I have to make the point, and you see a bunch of people torturing puppies, you have no response but to say, oh, well, I guess they're into torturing puppies. That's their thing, to each their own. Pluralism, on the other hand, doesn't claim that any particular group or ideology has all the answers, but asserts that there are some truths to be found, that we ought to be trying to find them. And importantly, that some things are wrong, and they are always wrong. So a pluralist can say that there should be a global ban on torturing puppies. I'm foursquare behind that, by the way. There should be a global ban on torturing puppies, while not taking a stand on, for example, whether life is always better with puppies. It is, unless you're allergic. Or what puppies should be called, or how we should name them, etc., so on. You see my point. Using secular universalist principles, like the one I mentioned before, Kant's categorical imperative, a pluralist can cordon off certain actions as always unethical, like rape, for example. Rape is never ethical under any circumstances, while still leaving a lot of open ground for disagreements among different groups of humans, and for long-lasting disagreements around definitions. As we all try to sort out how to lead good and meaningful lives, it's important that we recognize this distinction. And I'll take it a little bit further and say that moral relativism is often something that sneaks in when people are meaning to be tolerant. And I feel that that's important to note, because people with a very good will can fall into moral relativism because they don't wish to judge others of whom they don't know much, or they don't feel very different from them. The trouble with that is the absolute refusal to maybe not judge, but engage with the ideas of another person actually denies your shared humanity with them. If you truly think that you don't have enough in common with someone from another group to even have a conversation, then you are essentially saying they are so different that it's not clear that the two of you are even the same kind of being. And that is not true tolerance. Tolerance starts from understanding, and understanding is only possible if we accept the idea that we are all trying to find what these truths are. And we are all trying to do the right thing and figure out how we are supposed to live our lives. And where we disagree is in how to do that, but not in that pursuit is important. Pluralism allows us then to work together on mutually beneficial endeavors without having to agree on absolutely everything, and without sliding into some kind of empty both-siderism that fails to recognize that some actions and beliefs really are indefensible. You know, like Nazis. Nazis are bad. You heard it here, folks. And all of this really, really matters. And it matters for a reason that, again, we can all relate to and we can see the urgency of. It matters because if you look through history and you look at the greatest human accomplishments, every one of them was only possible because diverse voices and perspectives were allowed into the room to help solve the problem. Those people didn't have to agree on every social practice or nuance of meaning in order to work together. The only common ground they need is enough mutual respect to entertain the ideas of people who are not from identical backgrounds. Nor, and this too is important, do they need to force a consensus to make progress. They can agree to disagree on some points as long as they are still able to find a way forward where their interests converge. And again, as humans, we will have interests that converge, and arguably, the planet is getting smaller every day, and there are more and more of our mutual interests at stake. I feel it's important to make these points, even though they may feel obvious to some of you, because in the current discourse in this country, some of this idea has been challenged. I cite, for example, Fox News personality Tucker Carlson, who suggested that diversity is a weakness, not a strength, and that diverse people cannot work well together and cannot accomplish goals. My position is the exact opposite of that, and I believe that history is on my side. I would say further that we instinctively know that Tucker Carlson is wrong, and that diversity is strength, which is why no person, at least no sane, rational person, would ever say the following, and I want you to think about this for a second. Imagine someone actually saying this. We desperately need to find a cure for cancer, so let's only let white people work on that. Would any sane, rational person say that? I can't imagine. If the problem is urgent, we need everyone. It's also why in big sci-fi movies, you know what I mean, the big splashy ones where some kind of alien species is coming from far away to kill us all. I mean, I feel like the aliens are busy and they don't have time to mess with us, but in any case, they're always coming here to kill us all. And when this overwhelming alien menace threatens the whole planet, what happens? The people of Earth, or the Avengers or whatever, they come together, setting their differences aside for the common good. Why do these movies play so well? Because we instinctively know that's what you would need, and that's what would happen. You wouldn't say, oh, you can't help save the world, you're not like me. Be like, you got the skills, you get over here, we're about to be toasted by the aliens, they're gonna nuke us from orbit unless everybody helps. Audiences accept that premise because we know if the stakes are high enough, we would just choose the best people with the merit and ability to help. And this is the core point. At our heart, sane and rational people know that no one group has exclusive claim to those people. Earlier this month, and Meryl made mention of this, earlier this month we honored Dr. Farouk El-Baz with the 2018 Inamori Ethics Prize. We honored him for his extraordinary ethical leadership as a NASA Apollo program scientist and a global resource conservationist. And at that ceremony, I made some points, too, about the power of diversity. And I'd like to share some of those again here as they follow this same line of thought, and also because Meryl suggested I should. So, when we heard from Dr. Elbaz, one of the points he made was, for that moment in history, there was this call that was made, in a literal call, which I'll quote in a moment from the then President Kennedy, to do this extraordinary thing, to get people to the moon. And when that call was made, many people answered it. And they didn't look at, are all these people from just one small subset? They looked for, are these the people that we need? So when President John F. Kennedy declared, about to quote him, and I have to say it is so hard not to say it in the famous cadence that he says this in. If any of you have ever heard this, you're going to hear it now in your head, and I'm going to do it wrong. But I'll just say it normally. I can do this. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept and one we are unwilling to postpone. And when he said that, he laid down an ambitious marker that pushed us to the next frontier. And it happened. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. We did it. We actually did get human beings safely to the moon, and very importantly, back again. But we've only lately, very recently, started to become truly able to appreciate the incredible mosaic of unique people who toiled together to make that possible. It turns out that the tremendous effort that was needed for this historical achievement is actually a better reflection of what is best about this country or about the world than was fully understood or truly celebrated, certainly not at the time. It took profoundly dedicated, hardworking, creative, and extremely smart folks from diverse backgrounds, and they came together as a single powerful team to get the job done. They fought for a common cause, and it's important again to note that they fought pushing past obstacles, very, very challenging obstacles that included ignorance and bias. They harnessed their prodigious skills and their brilliant imaginations. Dr. Elbaz spoke about the importance of imagination to any great accomplishment. And they achieved what had once seemed impossible, and they did it together. So I will remind everyone in this room that we would not have gotten to the moon without the African American female computers, as they were called, such as Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, whose story was so beautifully told in the book and later the film Hidden Figures. We would not have gotten to the moon without NASA's first ever software engineer, Margaret Hamilton. We would not have gotten to the moon without Larry Murata, who worked on the Saturn V rocket and was later honored as Hispanic Engineer of the Year. And we would not have gotten to the moon without Egyptian-born immigrant Farouk Elbaz, who taught the astronauts what to expect when they took those famous first steps on the lunar surface. So where are we? Our nation's motto is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. And I truly believe that even the sky is not the limit when we set aside our differences, respect what each person brings to the table, and work together in the service of the common good. But sadly, we often lose sight of the simple beauty of this idea. We focus instead on trivial differences that divide us, things that should not matter at all. Not only should they not matter as much, they shouldn't matter at all. Like where we were born, or the color of our skin, or how we express ourselves, or whom we love. We allow these divisions to grow into hatred and distrust that just drives us further apart. And all of it is based on the irrational fear that the flourishing of someone else and the full exercise of their human rights will somehow restrict our choices or cause us harm. You probably heard this put as, rights are not pie. You can have a piece and I can have a piece and there's plenty left. The idea that other people having a voice harms us in some way is the big lie that we have to reject. Because the reality is that actually we all do better when everyone has the chance to be the best that they can be, and no one's possible contributions are lost because their genius is stifled or their voice is silenced. And I can't put this strongly enough. Where we are right now in the world today, we need all of us. We need all of us. Every scrap of talent, every fresh insight, every unrecognized great mind. We need them all to be welcomed out of the shadows. Because we face enormous challenges that do affect us all. From climate change to conflict resolution to cancer. And like reaching the moon, it will take the best of all of our energies and skills to surmount these challenges and leave a better world for our children. Thank you. Now, I was asked if I would do Q&A, and I love Q&A, so I said enthusiastically yes. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we have a hand mic because they're doing a recording. Oh, way in the back. Okay, I'm gonna run this to you. I feel like Phil Donahue. Does anyone else remember that? Showing my age here.
So are we forgetting about diversity when there's a lot of fear and uncertainty? What do you think of, why is it cropping up now?
I think what I call the big lie, the reason the big lie, sorry, I didn't mean to saddle you with that.
Okay.
Thanks. I think that the reason why that big lie has taken hold is precisely the fact that as people, on some level at least, recognize that the world is getting smaller, that we are more of a global community and actions in one country cannot be completely isolated and they do affect others, that scares people. You're absolutely right to use the word fear. Fear is at the heart of a lot of unethical behavior because it drives out the worst impulses. So the fear that comes there is that resources might be finite, that somehow if someone else is getting theirs, I might not get mine. And so people become instinctively more aligned with their subgroup, whatever that is, because they think there's safety there. If I close myself in to a smaller subset that agrees with me and encourages me, then I will be safe. Just think of it in terms of when there is some kind of disaster, you might run to your family or your created family of friends as the circle of protection. So if you feel a threatening world out there, whether that's from terrorism or climate change or whatever it is that's making you feel that way, your instinct is going to be like, I want to be like around people who are the most like me because it's comforting. It's that sense of family and comfort. And so the nasty side of that, or the side effect of that, is the tendency to then completely, and I'll use a term here, but to other the people who aren't in that group. Because that too, weirdly, can make you feel more safe, because you could say things that are happening are the fault of someone other than me, someone else, someone away who isn't like me, so I'm not to blame. And also, if I want to do things to them, I don't have to feel guilty because they're other. I dehumanize them. I put them in this subclass that I can harm with impunity. And also, maybe they're a little less scary, depends on how you view that. Sometimes it makes them more scary to put them in that category. But you can call on other leaders or other people from the outside to deal with that other. And you're going to be safe over here, and they're going to deal with that menace. So, I mean, it's an understandable human impulse in that way, but certainly not the best side of us as humans. And again, it's not sustainable because it just ignores the reality of how interdependent we in fact are and how we do need to work together to solve some of these problems. There's no hope otherwise. Fracturing is not the way to go. Other questions? Yes. I'm coming. There you go. I ran. She remembers.
On a scale
She remembers.
on a scale 1 to 10, what would you say that the ethics of the leaders, and I don't mean necessarily completely political leaders in this country, where do you see their ethics are, and can you compare that to, say, the ethics of 20 years ago? Why do you think that is?
Thanks for the easy one.
Yeah, I thought so.
No, fair enough. Totally fair question. Actually, I gave a talk recently, earlier this month, or was on a panel on the subject of morality and political leadership. So I've been thinking about this. Well, I think there's been a decline in the morality of political leaders. I say that with one word of caution, though, which is that to some degree there's nothing new under the sun. Things go in cycles, and I am not nostalgic for the past. I am hopeful for the future. But when I look at the past, I see more oppression. I see more groups isolated. So I don't want to go backwards. And I think that's important to clarify, that I don't want 20 years ago to be now. I want to leap ahead if I could. Can I teleport to the future? But what I think is going wrong, amongst many other things, part is actually to do with my answer to the previous question. I do think that leaders recognize that fear is a powerful motivator. And if you want to get people out to vote for your side, if you want to get people to mobilize for whatever, scaring them is a good way to do that. And dividing them and scaring them is a very good way to do that, because you can get your group really fierce around your issues, and you can divide your people that you're trying to silence. So it's rational in that sense to use that tactic. It works. But it's terrible long term. It has terrible long term effects, and it ultimately does not benefit the groups that use it. It ends up destroying them as well. So there's that. I think the other thing that you see is we're seeing changes in this country, in the world at large. I've already mentioned this. Changes around who is in power and who has a voice. And that scares people who used to be alone at the top. That is a natural reaction to say, wait a minute, I had unchallenged power for a really long time. And the thought of having that power challenged and having to compete with more people, arguably what I was saying there is, buckle up, people, there is more talent out there than you realize, and mediocrity is not going to prevail just because of privilege in the future. So that is certainly going to scare people enough for them to fight, whether it's the death throes or not, but they're going to fight fiercely for the last vestiges of the power that they had, because they can see it slipping away. So I think that's part of it. The last point I would make on that is that also I think the general decline in education is a problem. And what I mean by that is every one of us is a citizen of somewhere, and trying to, if only even a citizen of the world, and in trying to have voices as citizens, we need to know what we're talking about, at least to some degree. And the decline in education makes that harder. And people who can't discern lies from truths, or people who are fooled easily by propaganda, people who are vulnerable to those kinds of approaches because they don't know how to argue. They don't know how to use critical thinking to analyze what's being presented to them. That is a real danger. People who don't know history, who don't know, what has happened. So I see a genuine decline in education, and that is weakening the citizenship, and that is weakening the leaders, because they're appealing to the lowest common denominator. So, all the fixes that are needed are multifaceted, and one of them is education. Yes. Oh, thank you, Jeanette.
So Shannon, one of the takeaways I got from your comments was that we as a society make better decisions with diverse voices. Okay, but for some people, that term diversity is a stumbling block. I remember, I think some of it has to do with timing. Yeah. I think some people associate diversity with an effort to get around the term affirmative action. Yeah. Because they came sort of on the heels. They came on the heels of, the first chapters in the affirmative action movement. And so I just wonder, do you think there's any value in even rebranding what the effort is, so we can get away from that. I'm thinking one recent example was President Trump's recent effort to rebrand isolationism as sovereignty. Now, for other reasons, that didn't seem to catch hold, but it was to me, an example of trying to say, wait a minute, I know this approach has some stumbling blocks, people can't deal with that, but sovereignty, who's not in favor of sovereignty? So my point is, I just wonder, maybe a little bit beyond your expertise, but do you think we ought to think about whether or not the term is doing harm to the effort?
I mean, I think that's a wonderful question. We have to ask those kind of questions because whenever you're, reaching a brick wall in something, you have to say, what can we change? What can we change to break through that wall? And if rebranding were something that could do that, I would be in favor of that. I don't have myself right now off the top of my head an alternative word, but I do think making the point, and I say this in full knowledge that people are making this point. I'm not saying that they're not, but continuing, I should say, to make the point that when we say diversity, we are talking about, again, bringing people from all different backgrounds to get their different perspectives so that we can accomplish things better and quicker and everything good. That is perhaps not what people do think, and particularly people who may have picked up various biases through the years. That's not what they think of when they hear that word. They might not think of that. And so giving examples from history, like the example of, I think it's funny because when I talk about the Apollo missions, I think there are people who, because the visible face of NASA was so much these very prominent figures of the astronauts themselves, and they were all white males, the astronauts of the Apollo program, that they think that that's how we got to the moon, or that's in their head. And so just simply showing that that isn't true, and just saying, no, we got to the moon with this group of people. And if you looked at that group, what would you say? This is a diverse group, a wildly diverse group, a more diverse group than you might have expected back in that time. But they, again, were forced to be more diverse than the social times would have even encouraged, because they needed the talent, and that's where the talent was. So, that showing people that their misconceptions about what can be accomplished with a non-diverse group, that I think is helpful. Is just to point out, and I do this, for example, even in other fields. I work, as you heard, in military ethics and so forth, and I often have to point out about women veterans or women who worked. There was just a wonderful woman who just passed away this month she lived to 92, but she had been one of the key women who helped crack the German codes. She died here in America, but the UK sent over and did formal military honors for her with a British flag draped over her coffin because of the role she played in World War II. And reading about her and telling people about her, I was thinking how few people recognize the role of women in that part of the war, the role of women in other wars, and just reminding folks of those kind of things, I think, is a bit of a tonic against this pushback. But that doesn't change my original response, which is you still may be right that word may have taken on some weight that we can't shake off. And if there's another word that will get through, then I'm always open to trying another way to communicate, because I do think at the end of the day, where there's any chink, where there are open minds at all, we need to get in there. Anyone else?
Thank you. Hi, Dr. French.
I know you. You're one of my master's students.
So you made what I think to be a persuasive argument for pluralism. And I guess my question...
You've never heard me rail against moral relativism in class.
Never at all. And I think my question with pluralism would be, does pluralism always look progressive? And then in reference to diversity, do you think a flourishing of pluralism can happen, can exist outside of a social contract? As well as, what do you think the relationship in a flourishing of pluralism, like us moving more towards pluralism, would do in relation to some of the social institutions that we have, whether it be detrimental or, even good?
No, No, excellent questions. One point I would make certainly is that, as I emphasized, true pluralism rules some things out. So it doesn't mean let every flower bloom. It means let many flowers bloom, but some flowers you're going to kill. And so there are going to be some ideologies, for example, that are not going to be allowable. So I mean, I'll use an awful example just because it makes the point. I mean, there are groups that think that child abuse and pedophilia is not bad. You know, that they promote it. They think it's a good thing. I'm not going to let that group into this pluralistic perspective, because I can use Kant, I can use many other approaches. It's actually not that hard to prove that is an idea that violates the most basic concepts of ethics and violates the most basic principles of morality and autonomy and so forth. So I can rule that out and not let them in the tent, even if it's a very big tent. So I think that's one point that you have to make, is that pluralism is not going to let everyone in the mix. But I do think that it requires us to maybe be even more tolerant than some of us might naturally wish to be. You know, we all have our quirks, we all have things that rub us the wrong way, and in order to get along, we are going to have to silence some of those objections, at least in that arena where we are working together, whilst being able to make them in other contexts. So part of what I imagine in what I'm arguing for, in the society I'm arguing for, is that when we are working together, we show respect for one another, and as I mentioned in my talk, say there are areas where we agree to disagree, but that doesn't close the door on those areas. So then when we're not actively working together, we would still write and argue and try to persuade the other side. Having respect for someone doesn't mean you don't try to change their mind. I always think of John Stuart Mill talks about how you can't compel someone to do something, but you sure can try to persuade them, to cajole them. You can try every other trick in the book to try to get them to change their opinion. You just can't force it on them. So that's that line that we can't cross, but there's a lot of energy you can put behind trying to change minds. So yeah, I think that balance is tricky. It is, because there are groups that I would disagree with some of their views, and I would say, I don't want them making other people feel unwelcome because of their views, but I would still say that I would need to argue that point in the public sphere in a polite and respectful way. Whereas if it crosses that line I was talking about, then I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to defend your right to be a neo-Nazi, for example. It's like, nope, you don't get to be that. You don't get to be a misogynist. It's like, nope, there's no room in the tent for you.
How do you separate that persuasion process from existing power structures, I guess was...
Another hard one. I think the trouble is, and I think this is partly what you're alluding to, is that the existing power structures do favor the people currently in power. That's just the nature of the beast. So changing them is agonizing process. So all we can do is hope that people recognize the power that they do have. I mean, this is maybe feels like a weak appeal, but certainly in this moment again that we are in this country where we're coming up on a big election and so forth, reminding people of the power to vote, for example, is a way of saying that people who are not currently in power still do have some power. And they can enlarge that power if they join together and they make their voices magnified by finding other people that do agree with them. And I actually think that some of the things that have had negative effects, I see some negative effects to things like social media and so forth, that can also have positive effects. You can see how people have used that to come together, whether it's the Arab Spring or in this country trying to draw voices together that might not otherwise know that anyone is out there agreeing with them. And that again can be used for good or evil, but I don't like it when it means that neo-Nazis find other neo-Nazis and feel validated. That's not helpful. But it is helpful if someone who feels alone and says, has anyone else ever felt this particular thing? And then they reach out and someone says, yes, I know what that feels like, and let's try to change it. that can be progress. So I'm gonna hold on to some optimism here, Dalton. I know he's had my classes, so he knows sometimes I get a little down, and I even joke about having, speaking of social media, hashtag humanity sucks, so I have my moments. But at the end of the day, I'm gonna cling to some optimism that we can keep moving in a good direction, and that some of the movement that seems in the wrong direction is indeed death throes. So many hands, okay.
I've kind of got, I guess, a two-sided question, and touches on what you were just discussing. On one level, pluralism relies on the fact that you have to have some sort of fundamental agreement on certain fundamental truths, correct? So how would you go about determining whether or not a group or an ideology falls outside of that? And I guess who makes that decision, and how would you address that in the public sphere? Like, for example, you mentioned neo-Nazis and groups who feel that child molestation is completely kosher. Do you just ignore them? Like, how would you handle that?
Excellent questions again. I would not ignore them. I think we have to confront them directly, and I think there's an individual answer and a collective answer. Let me do the collective answer first, which I'll allude again to something that Dalton mentioned, the social contract. We do collectively agree on boundaries and rules. We do, as a society, any society comes together and says, these are the things we're going to allow in our society, and these are the things we're not going to. And in a society like ours, and I think this is a good thing, those are somewhat changeable. We do evolve them. We do say, we used to allow this, but we shouldn't, or we used to not allow this, but we should. So there are changes that you can make in the laws of the land that make those boundaries. Because I often clarify that ethics and the law are not the same, and they're not. But the law is, to some degree, those outer boundaries that we can agree on. So it's like, we may not agree on all this messy gray mess in the middle, but at least we're going to say, but that's too far. You can't do that, and that we're going to make against the law. That while that isn't enough for the flourishing life that I was talking about, it is a start. But on an individual basis, the answer for me is going to come from my philosophical tradition. So I'm going to argue, I mentioned Kant before, and I'm not a hardcore Kantian, but I use some of his work to get where I want to get in terms of having a argument that doesn't necessarily depend on any particular, for example, religious tradition, to argue for why he gives really sound, just logical arguments why slavery is a harm, why rape is a harm, why murder is a harm. These may seem obvious, but he lays out why it is without depending on another belief system. So that I think is helpful, is having those out there as tools. And his is not the only one. There's others, and I apologize for using mostly Western references there, but there are others in other traditions that you can draw on that will give you those core principles to lay those outer boundaries. But with that in mind, I think then you do have to engage to some degree with people who are outside those boundaries if they appear to be getting normalized. So as long as they are shunned, or my colleague at Princeton, Kwame Appiah, has done some beautiful work around shame and the power of shame in society to make change. And as long as they are being shamed, whether they accept the shame or not, then we're sort of okay. But if they are shameless, if people are, for example, doing racist tirades and shamelessly doing them and not caring and feeling like, why should anyone be mad that I did that? Then something's broken, and we have to make them ashamed again. And that is part of the ongoing work of citizenship, is to say, no, we're going to say that isn't okay, and we are going to judge and hold you accountable. But I say that with a full acknowledgement that that's dangerous work, and depending on who you're talking about holding accountable, that could be very, very risky, and people have died for less. So, I've got several up front here. Jeanette, wait, yeah.
Hi, I also sort of have a two-part question. First is, in your conception, is diversity merely useful insofar as that it's instrumental for large societal goals like the moon landing? And then does your conception of the good life necessarily include working towards large societal projects?
Oh, interesting. I think more that there is that unmistakable instrumental value to diversity that is good to remind people of. So that is partly the rhetorical argument that I was making before, or argument for a useful rhetoric, I should say, that we can possibly persuade people who otherwise might have a closed mind to this idea by saying, now look, here are practical positive outcomes and in fact very urgent needs that can be addressed with this. But I don't mean to say, and I'm glad you raised this, that diversity doesn't have its value in and of itself, that it doesn't have any intrinsic value. And I think the intrinsic value comes back to another core point in ethics or core point in philosophy. I mentioned respect and autonomy, dignity and respect. Seeing people, God, I sound like such a Kantian today. You're going to mock me for this later, aren't you? When did you become a hardcore Kantian? It just works today. But there is a very useful bit in Kant where he talks about the problem of treating people as mere means to an end versus seeing them as an end in themselves. And the idea of seeing someone as an end in him or herself is to say that you are recognizing that this is in front of you another autonomous being who is making choices and trying to navigate life, and that you don't have anything magically special about you that gives you the right to interfere with and impede that autonomy, and that instead you have to negotiate with them and you have to persuade, back to Mill's point, rather than force them. So if I strip you of that autonomy in any way by imposing my will on you, I am doing a harm to you. And if I allow you to do it to me, I'm allowing a harm unto myself, and I have to fight that to the best of my ability. Or if I can't fight, someone has to fight for me. So that brings it back to a very intrinsic value, that where we fail to recognize diversity, we are ultimately denying people's humanity. We are harming them. It is a direct harm because, and this is, again, independent of any religious belief or anything else, any belief about a divine spark or anything like that. There's just the undeniable fact that whatever kind of creatures you think we are, we do seem to have the ability to choose to some degree what we do and what we are, more than, you know, my iPhone that I can pick up and toss around. And to the degree that we have that autonomy, then interfering with it is a full stop harm. It is always a harm. And many crimes interfere with autonomy in ways subtle and not so subtle. Anyone else?
There was a book that was released in the summer called White Fragility. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it.
I haven't seen that one, no.
Okay, so in that, she's saying that white people need to take a hard look at themselves and to see that racism is pretty much institutionalized in this country, for example, and through history books and through the way we've just been taught. And that if you've basically been through the school system here, you're racist just by default, white people. So I haven't read the book completely, but I just thought that was kind of interesting when you were talking about shame, because she said so many people, racism has such a negative connotation to it that people do not examine themselves because it's so shameful to be racist for a lot of people. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that you said shame works, but sometimes maybe it could be not a positive influence if it keeps people from really analyzing and looking at it. And I also wondered if how much do you think that writing the history books that have been written need to be rewritten in order to show multiple sides to different events that have basically been told by a European viewpoint?
I'm going to quickly take the last question first and just say yes on history being rewritten to show multiple viewpoints. So many levels of yes, yes, and hey, it's job creation for humanities people. But no, we do need that, and that, and particularly because, as I was mentioning earlier, we're dealing with actually false stories being told or false narratives being perpetuated. So without those corrections, it's just going to continue. But to your earlier point, I actually want to connect this a little bit to the point that was made about diversity and branding, because it's related in my mind. I think that I don't disagree with that basic premise, but I think that there is a difference between bias and racism. And what I mean by that is, and maybe I'm using this in just an ordinary language way, and it could be argued the other direction as well, but to me, racism implies a commitment to the bias, whereas the bias, knowing the bias exists, does not necessarily make you racist. I think bias is everywhere. Bias is very prevalent, and some people are going to have more of it than others, and against certain things. There's some wonderful work done on this by a fellow named Jerry Kang at UCLA that I found very important, because he was talking about, he started working in legal systems and recognizing bias and charting it, and then ended up recognizing how pervasive bias was and how it affected so many things. And one of the things that he argues, which it relates to this point again, is that your obligation is not to be completely unbiased, because that appears to be unachievable. I mean, we are all affected by things we can't control to give us certain biases. But to as great a degree as you can be, to be aware of those biases that you possess, and to be mindful, he uses the word mindful a lot, of them, and try to counteract them in some way. And there's various techniques that you can do that. So if you are aware that you have a bias that favors a group that you belong to, and therefore disadvantages some other group, then you need to correct for that in some active way, so that you're not just saying, oh, well, that's just how it is. You're saying, and that's bad. So to me, the difference between bias and racism is the racist person would say, yes, I have this bias and I'm on board with it, and I'm completely committed to that bias and I love this bias. Whereas someone else may say, yeah, I probably do have that bias. Look at me, I was raised amongst bias in everything from the media to the schools to the textbooks. I almost certainly got it in there deep. So what do I do next is to try to notice when it's happening, notice the effects, educate myself, keep coming back to education, and try to counteract it once again with diversity. I mean, if you bring in different voices to challenge you, then that is one of the best things you can do to balance out your own bias, is to say, I am likely to have even more biases than I am aware of. So the more voices I bring in to check what I'm doing, the more likelihood I am that I might hear something that would not have come naturally to me that I need to hear. So I mean, I don't think it's perfect. We're not going to get to perfection, but that idea of mindfulness and frankly some humility around our bias is going to be helpful, to the degree that we can just say, yeah, I've got this. And the word shame in that context, I think it's all right to occasionally feel ashamed that if you have certain biases that you wish you didn't have, but not to let that shame be paralysis. If that shame stops you, as you were saying, from making any changes or addressing it, then that's obviously unhelpful. And I think that you can have a moment of, I wish I didn't feel this way, but okay, I do feel this way, so how do I get past it? How do I counteract it? What voices do I need around me to stop me from doing that? Because I can't defend it. It's not right. So that's all any of us can do.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Got another quick question. You've mentioned kind of implicitly throughout this that diversity for diversity's sake is prima facie beneficial. I was wondering, how do you account for or evaluate successful societies that are relatively monocultural, like the Scandinavian countries, or a lot of more Oriental countries like Japan or China, which are very, very homogenous, but are relatively successful in light of other countries that are more diverse that may or may not be better or worse off in a variety of metrics?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too stuck in specific examples, but since you mentioned Japan, and I travel there frequently because my center is the Inamori Center, so I have to go to Japan. If you don't know what I'm referencing, it was founded by, or it was set up by a generous gift from the Inamori Foundation, which is in Kyoto, Japan. So I have to travel there and learn more about their work every year. But in any case, so I've now gone to Japan quite a large number of times. So that's a helpful reference point, I'll say, for myself. In that case, certainly Japan's lack of diversity is harmful, and it is harming them right now in many active ways. For example, there's a somewhat xenophobic tendency that has pushed hard against things like immigration, but they have a shrinking population and an aging population, and they don't have enough caregivers, and because they're unwilling to welcome in caregivers from the outside, at the moment the solution that seems to be the most prominent one is to try to build healthcare robots to solve the problem, but there are huge problems with that. So I'd argue that that's an example of it. There is there are actively identifiable downsides to their lack of diversity that you can quickly highlight. Now, people talk about lack of diversity in some of the Scandinavian countries. It's sort of funny, but this just came up for me the other day with Sweden. We are often, I should only speak for myself, but I was a little naive about how little diversity there was. There is more than I thought. And so that's another point, is we sort of might picture certain places as less diverse than they are. This came up because I was talking about a certain historical figure from Sweden, and I was trying to figure out, where they had come from, and it was much more diversity than I had expected. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that. There's much more interaction with other cultures than I had thought. They're not that isolated. Which is, by the way, once I thought of it, I went, well, duh, because seafaring countries tend to not be all that isolated, and they tend to have more diversity. So I should have known better, but I didn't have that much awareness. But my point is also to make another use of the word diversity. I do think that diversity of thought matters too. I mean, diversity is not merely these more superficial things that I mentioned that divide us sometimes and shouldn't, that are not chosen and don't matter. Like how much pigment we have in our skin. What ought to matter also is differences in background, differences in perception, differences in the way that we experience the world, and those differences are found in, I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think every human society has that kind of diversity, and we just don't always call it that. And where I see the real danger occurring is where people who think alike, and in many cases also look alike, but certainly the think alike who have gone through the world in the same way, are only talking to one another. And that is where you get, I think, this tremendous loss of innovation and so forth, because you just don't have those different minds. I mean, in the argument in this country around immigration, it's been pointed out how many of our great innovators were immigrants. That doesn't mean only immigrants are innovators, but it just means if you're trying to find a whole lot of great innovations, you want both. You want every voice brought into the mix.
Great. One more comment?
I guess it's like in a response to that, but coinciding with your response to that. I think the answer to the question, I don't know if this is on, but
I think it is. It just doesn't echo. It's for the recording more than anything.
Largely depends on like the distinction between common usage and definition of both success and diversity with respect to a society. I think like the Scandinavian region is really only politically and economically defined like a more de facto by the Scandia region, where the three countries meet, because Finland and Iceland are not really part of that. And there's lots of still even so diversity within that region, agricultural and ethnic. I mean, even if you were to expand the definition of the Scandinavian region to like the Finno-Scan region or Iceland, you would see that large parts of Iceland were discovered at different times. Finland and Sweden and Norway both have problems integrating their native populations, like many other countries, like the Sami people there is a prime example. And they, I mean, large universities there excel because they integrate their Sami population. I think maybe the better distinction to be made is between tolerance and diversity, because a lot of empires have succeeded by tolerating populations and taxing them, as opposed to just accepting them and making their culture part of their own, and thereby making it maybe like what you're using as diversity, but maybe not as like the formal definition. So it really has to do with, like, I think, common usages and formal definitions of success and those things.
I'm going to accept that as a helpful clarification. Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking Dr. French for her sharing. She didn't even leave you with us.